Do you know that the United States used to spend $60 billion to $70 billion on USAID every year? This was meant to be given to countries fighting poverty and supporting humanitarian causes. However, that's the excuse to be shown to the world. In reality, there have been reports of USAID programs involved in regime change operations throughout the world. Countries struggling with poverty allow USAID to enter, but end up being controlled and dictated by the agency. In other words, USAID worked as a foreign policy tool for the United States. However, this has ended now as Donald Trump has cut down 90% of USAID operations, creating a vacuum for China to fill. That's something China has always wanted, but countries were too uncertain to leave the US for China. But now, with the USAID gone, it's an open ground for China to conquer. So how can Trump's decision to end foreign aid make China the new superpower? In this video, let's know about the whole story. Until now, USAID ensured American dominance in the world, offering aid in return for countries following American foreign policy. This, however, changed drastically under Donald Trump. Driven by his America First ideology, Trump effectively ended USAID by slashing its budget by 90%, pulling the U.S. out of foreign assistance programs, and closing the door on what had been one of the most significant instruments of American soft power. In doing so, Trump left a massive vacuum, one that China was eager to fill. For years, China had been competing with the U.S. in global development, but countries were often reluctant to completely shift alliances. Now, with the U.S. abandoning the field, China is stepping in as the primary development partner for nations across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. However, to really understand what America lost and China gained, it's important to understand how USAID worked. For decades, USAID allowed Washington to manipulate governments without resorting to military force. Instead of sending troops, the U.S. used foreign aid to exert political influence, ensuring that countries aligned with American economic and diplomatic interests. This influence was particularly strong in Africa, where aid was often tied to conditions that favored U.S. corporations and restricted engagement with Chinese firms. In Latin America, USAID-backed programs funneled money into opposition groups that Washington supported, while in Eastern Europe, the agency played a role in propping up governments that embraced Western policies. But this was not just about economics or governance. USAID was also a strategic weapon in the information war. The agency spent millions funding media outlets, journalists, and NGOs that pushed narratives favorable to U.S. interests while discrediting China and Russia. It was through USAID-backed media that Washington promoted its version of events in Ukraine, Venezuela, and various African nations, portraying itself as a benevolent force while painting its rivals as destabilizing actors. This was a war of influence, and for years, the U.S. had the upper hand. However, with Trump shrinking USAID's budget and shutting down most of its operations, that influence has collapsed almost overnight. The U.S. is no longer a major player in development aid, and with Washington withdrawing from the global stage, countries that once depended on American support are now turning to China for assistance. The consequences of this shift are massive, as it effectively hands Beijing a level of influence that Washington spent decades trying to prevent. But how will China replace the United States and present itself as a more reliable partner? Well, with the U.S. abandoning its role as a global aid provider, China has rapidly positioned itself as the world's leading development partner through its Belt and Road Initiative. Unlike USAID, which often provided funds tied to political conditions, China's approach is straightforward. Yes, it offers hard infrastructure like roads, railways, energy projects, and ports, without demanding political allegiance in return. This model has made China an attractive alternative for governments that previously had no choice but to rely on U.S. assistance. The sheer scale of China's development financing dwarfs what the US was offering. Between 2000 and 2021, China spent an astonishing $1.34 trillion on nearly 18,000 development projects, outpacing USAID's global efforts. And the impact of these investments is already evident. In Cambodia, for example, the US withdrew a $6.3 million grant meant for demining operations, but China immediately stepped in with $4.4 million to fill the gap. In Peru, while US aid was focused on financing coffee and cacao production, China was building a $1.3 billion megaport in Chancay, directly reshaping the country's economic landscape. Africa, in particular, has seen a dramatic shift in influence. For decades, USAID operated in African nations under the guise of development assistance, often using funding as a tool to pressure governments into economic reforms that benefited Western corporations. But now, with USAID's withdrawal, China is rapidly expanding its role. It has already committed over $50 billion in new investments across the continent, financing everything from railway networks and energy plants to digital infrastructure and industrial zones. The result is that African nations, once hesitant to fully embrace Beijing, are now turning to China as their primary economic partner. This is changing everything. The most significant consequence of Trump's decision is that it eliminates the US as a competitor in the global development race. Previously, countries had to balance their relationships between Washington and Beijing, as the US actively worked to counter China's influence by offering alternative funding. But now, with the US retreating, China has no opposition. Countries that once relied on American assistance are left with only one choice: China. The shift in global influence is already visible in Africa, where Chinese-built infrastructure projects now dominate. In Southeast Asia, where the US once funded governance and education programs, China is now leading digital expansion efforts and renewable energy initiatives. Even in Latin America, where the US has historically been the dominant foreign power, China's economic footprint is growing at an unprecedented rate. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. Interestingly, this transformation is not just about economic assistance, it is about long-term strategic dominance. As nations become more economically dependent on China, they also align themselves politically and diplomatically with Beijing. This means that in future geopolitical conflicts, Washington will find itself increasingly isolated as more countries shift their loyalties toward China. What's more interesting is that USAID is not the only international program the United States has decided to end. The US has left the United Nations Human Rights Council, World Health Organization, and Paris Climate Agreement, hinting toward the trend that in future, the United States won't participate in any international affair. Even the United States' closest allies have begun to see this. The Munich Security Conference highlighted the deepening rift between the US and its European allies. Vice President J.D. Vance's aggressive rhetoric, particularly on European security and the war in Ukraine, alienated key leaders. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius called his remarks unacceptable, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that transatlantic relations were collapsing. In stark contrast, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi struck a calming tone, presenting China as Europe's partner, not a rival. He offered Beijing's involvement in brokering peace in Ukraine, signaling China's growing role as a diplomatic power. Vance's speech was a diplomatic disaster, reinforcing European fears that Trump's administration is abandoning its commitments. With Washington turning inward, European leaders are being forced to rethink their alliances, and China is stepping in as an alternative. Beijing has spent years expanding its global influence through economic partnerships, particularly with its Belt and Road Initiative, which has funneled over $1.34 trillion into global infrastructure projects. Now, with Trump undermining NATO and other multilateral agreements, China sees an opportunity to deepen its engagement with Europe and other key regions. Now, some U.S. officials have begun to realize the disastrous consequences of Trump's decision. Lawmakers such as Senator Andy Kim have warned that the U.S. is essentially handing over global leadership to China, while others have called for a reassessment of American foreign aid policy. However, the problem is that there is no clear alternative to USAID. The U.S. does not have the economic capacity or public support to compete with China's massive infrastructure spending. And with American voters largely opposed to foreign aid, there is little chance that Washington will reverse course. What this means is that the U.S. has effectively abandoned its position as the world's leading power in development aid, and there is no going back. The influence that USAID once provided is now shifting entirely to China, and once Beijing establishes itself as the primary development partner for these nations, Washington will never be able to reclaim its former role. From this point on, the era of American leadership ends and the rise of China begins. Trump's decision to dismantle USAID marks one of the most significant geopolitical shifts in modern history. What was once a carefully managed balance of power is now an open field for China to dominate. The U.S. has not only lost its ability to shape global events through economic influence, but it has also handed China an uncontested path to superpower status. As the U.S. fades from the international stage, China is stepping up not just as an investor, but as the new global leader in economic and geopolitical influence. Developing nations no longer look to Washington for guidance. Instead, they turn to Beijing. The U.S. has surrendered its global position not because it was defeated, but because it walked away. The world is watching, and China is taking over. Now, it's to be seen how China claims the superpower position and uses its status to rule the world. What do you think? Will countries fall in China's lap as the United States has pulled back its hand? Isn't it true that most of Trump's actions are helping China to come to the forefront and claim the new superpower status? In the comments section right below, share your thoughts on what if China gets the same level of influence and control in countries as the United States enjoys. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs. Things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.